Hello again. Here is our third video for this week. I'm going to talk a little bit about plant functional groups now, introduce you to the concept, and give you some examples of the important plant functional groups that we'll be discussing throughout the semester. So if I were in class, I would put up this slide and we would take a poll and see how many people thought, or how many species people thought there were around the world. So this is how many different species there are. So the answer is 297,326 about. There's around 300,000 plants on planet Earth. And these are terrestrial plants, I should say. The point of this is that there's a whole lot of plant species out there. And our goal as managers and conservationists are to manage or conserve, as many of these species as we can. And in order to do that, we have to understand something about all these species. We can't manage species that we know nothing about their behavior, how they would respond to drought, or how they would respond to cold temperatures, or how they would respond to some management treatment, right? So we need to know something essentially about all of these species out there if we're going to, be stewards of these species and try to manage them as best as possible. However, 300,000 species is a lot of species to learn about, as far, not just like you learning information about them, but I mean us actually as scientists studying them. It takes a long time to do research projects to identify some of the plant growth strategies and survival strategies, reproductive strategies. There's just no way we can do it on all 300,000, at least not anytime in the near future. I mean, we have species, maize. We've been studying maize for decades to grow it better and make it more productive, and we're still learning stuff about it all the time. So, so times that by 300,000, and you can see how long it might take to understand all these species. So our goal in ecology, or at least of a lot of researchers and scientists in ecology, is to try to take this large set of species and simplify it in some way so that they're easier to group plants in a way that would describe how a group of plants might behave versus an individual species. And so there's been lots of ways of doing this, and one of the kind of common and popular ways right now is with what are called plant functional groups. So instead of identifying every species and how it might function or respond to some environmental change, we group species into these plant functional groups or plant functional types. So it's a way of us, of humans simplifying the complexity that is in nature. And so the plant functional groups I'm going to talk about are listed here. We're going to talk briefly about temperate needle-leaf evergreen trees, which essentially are our gymnosperms. We're going to talk about temperate broadleaf deciduous trees. So these would be our deciduous angiosperms. We have broadleaf evergreen trees. So again, this would be, we'll say evergreen angiosperms. Let's say this one is deciduous angiosperms. We have shrubs, forbs, which I said in the last video I'll define a little bit better, grasses, succulents, and legumes. So I'm just going to go through each of these, talk about kind of its general characteristics. And really by that I just mean kind of what is its growth strategy, what is it good at doing, what is it bad at doing, as far as what type of environment it might be successful in. So let's go ahead and get started. So our temperate needle-leaf evergreen trees, or our gymnosperms. Here are some of the characteristics of this plant functional group. Typically, we think of these as having a long leaf lifespan. What that means is after a tree grows an individual needle on the tree, it keeps that needle or that leaf for a really long period of time, which is kind of intuitive. It's not like a deciduous tree dropping them every year. It's hanging on to them for a long time. And we have examples of trees that will hang on to their needles for 25 to 30 years. So they're reusing those needles a really long time. Another thing this plant functional group is known for is being good stress tolerators. They're pretty good at tolerating low nutrients. They're good at tolerating drought. They're good at tolerating cold. So these are stress tolerators. A couple of the unique characteristics of these trees are the anatomy, the type of cells it actually uses to transport water makes it unique, and its crown architecture. And we'll come back and talk about its crown architecture after our first exam. So just to highlight this anatomical difference a little bit and give you some insight into that. Actually, I'm going to skip to the next slide here. The cells that plants use for transporting water, these are all part of what's called the xylem. And so the xylem transports water from the roots up to the leaves. And gymnosperms and angiosperms have some different adaptations, some different types of cells to do this. So I can't find a great picture of a tracheid, but a tracheid is the only cells that gymnosperms use to transport water. And this is a picture of a tracheid. The main point of these tracheids is that, or the main point I want to make, is that each end of an individual cell is closed. You can see how the outside of these cells come to a point on both ends. That means they're closed cells. And the only way water can move up through these, so let me back up just a second. So if you were looking at the inside of a tree, this is an individual tracheid, and there would be, after this tracheid, there would be another tracheid like up here, and then another tracheid, and they all kind of overlap, but they would move up through the tree. And in order for water to move up through there, it has to pass through these little pits. So it would pass through a pit from a tracheid down here, and it would go into this cell. Once it gets to the end of this cell, it'd have to go out of this pit and into another tracheid and up and into another tracheid. So it kind of zigzags its way in and out of these cells. And this is a fairly slow process. They can't move water very fast, but these cells are really good at keeping the water in the plants even during drought and when it's really cold. Alternatively, this cell here is called a vessel element. It's the cells that angiosperms use. And these are more like open pipes. So in this picture in the bottom right is a scanning electron micrograph of a vessel element. And you can see the end of it is open. So this isn't broken off, this is just the end of the cell. And they stack these cells on top of each other and basically make a big pipe up through the plant. And so that makes water transport really fast because it doesn't have to cross through these little pits. All right? The downside is these do not tolerate really cold temperatures or drought very well. All right? So this is one way that this is one way that gymnosperms are good stress tolerators, is their anatomy. The cells they use are different and allow them to be better stress tolerators. Okay, so that's gymnosperms. Let's talk about angiosperms now. These are temperate broadleaf deciduous trees we're going to talk about. General characteristics. I don't like how these bullets ended up. So generally, we consider the temperate broadleaf deciduous trees to be really fast growing, but not very stress tolerant. So they do really good at growing quickly, but they can't handle a whole lot of stress, whatever it is, nutrients, temperatures, water. But these plants are really good at competing for water and light. And they're generally fairly deep-rooted. All right, so those are the characteristics. I'm sorry, I just realized that I don't like how this is laid out. There we go. These are the general characteristics of temperate broadleaf trees. So if you want to kind of contrast this with the gymnosperms are kind of tough trees that can handle a lot of stress, but not quite as good at competing for resources. And then temperate broadleaf deciduous is the opposite. They're really good at competing for all of these resources and growing quickly, but they're not very good at tolerating stress. All right, let's talk briefly about broadleaf evergreen trees. Again, these are also angiosperms, but they're not deciduous, so they keep their leaves on year-round. Generally, these plants have really thick, tough leaves because they're that these leaves have to stay on the tree for a really long period of time, so they have to be a little bit tougher. Obviously, we have really long growing season that these trees are adapted to, and generally they're tolerant of low fertility. So they're found in places where there's some nutrient that is limiting, and these plants can grow pretty well in that type of environment. So we don't have a lot of broadleaf evergreens in the U.S., definitely some in some areas, but it's not a functional group that's really dominant here in the U.S. or in North America. Okay, let's talk about shrubs briefly. So shrubs are going to be plant functional groups that we find most commonly in semi-arid and arid environments. Some of the characteristics of shrubs are that they have really deep and or really wide root systems. So sometimes there's shrubs that don't have very deep roots, but they can go out, 10, 20 meters out away from the canopy of the plant. So they can be really wide. They also generally have small leaves, which helps them deal with really high temperatures. And generally, they're fairly drought tolerant and use less water than trees. And part of the reason they use less water than trees is just they have a lot less leaf area. But that's why this growth form is effective in dry places, because it's not trying to put on lots of leaves. And so it's better at conserving water. So just a little bit of a visual here to help you remember that shrubs are known for these deep or wide roots. This is an ecophysiologist from University of New Mexico, and they're studying these roots. Here you can see in the picture there's this group of roots coming through, and they're measuring the rate that water is moving through these roots. And this is a group of shrub roots found in caves about 70 feet below the surface. This cave entrance is actually in Austin, Texas, right by, I forget the name of the bridge, but there's a bridge where there's this huge bat colony that comes out every night, and this entrance is right by that bridge. And so they've been studying the roots down in that cave. And you can see these roots are still going down deeper. So very deep roots in these shrubs. Not all shrubs, just a lot of shrubs. Okay, forbs. Let's talk about those just a bit. Forbs, kind of our more scientific definition, is that they are herbaceous dicots, this first bullet point up here. Meaning herbaceous, meaning they don't have woody tissue. They're just all kind of green, leafy type of tissue. But they're dicots. And so if you have forgotten what a dicot versus a monocot is, here's just a little information. A cotyledon, if you remember, so cotyledon is the primary leaf that is preformed inside a seed. So when a seed is formed, it already has these two tiny little leaves that are just ready to grow as soon as that seed germinates. There's a group of plants that make two of those leaves, so dicotyledonous or dicotyledons, or we refer to it for short as dicot. There are a group of plants that only make one of those cotyledons inside a seed, and those are referred to as monocots. So that's the difference. This is just a picture right after those seeds have germinated. You can see these two leaves here. Those are the cotyledons, so the two of them. And then this is a monocot, or it just has one cotyledon growing. So that's the difference between monocot and dicot. Forbs are dicots. Much like when I talked in the last video about angiosperms and gymnosperms, kind of representing this different evolutionary pathway. Same thing with monocots and dicots. Yes, there's this difference in the number of leaves that are in the seeds, but it's representative of a lot of other differences between these growth forms. So that's why we group them in different plant functional groups. Forbs, again, are herbaceous dicots. This is a really, really diverse functional group. It's not a very good functional group, to be honest, because there's so many different types of plants within forbs. But we're just starting to really understand a lot of these forbs. So maybe we'll come up with a different plant functional group. And indeed, people do divide them into different plant functional groups. But for what we're talking about in this class, we're going to leave them as just one plant functional group. But just remember, it's really diverse. And generally, we think of forbs as being good at growing in disturbed areas. So we've got a lot of invasive species or kind of like pioneer species that would fall in this category of being a forb. We have perennial forbs and annual forbs. The perennial forbs are rarely dominant. They're important in a lot of systems, but they're rarely the dominant species. And annual forbs are the ones that we really think of as being great at adapting or being adapted to disturbed areas. All right, so that's forb. We've talked about this monocot-dicot difference. So forbs are herbaceous dicots, grasses are herbaceous monocots. So they kind of have that different evolutionary pathway. So can function very differently from the dicots. One of the biggest key differences of grasses compared to all these other growth forms we're talking about is where the meristem tissue is located. The meristematic tissue, or I should just put meristem, is located below ground. And again, just to refresh everybody, the meristem tissue, it's the area of the plant that contains undifferentiated cells that are going to give rise to new growth. So this is basically where the growth is happening inside a plant, is in the meristem tissue or meristematic region. So this is a picture of a dicot. This is a young tree, and its meristem is up here at the very top, called apical meristem, because it's at the apex of the plant. Here's a grass in this picture on the left, and it shows in circles are all the places that it has meristem. So it's got a lot of different types of meristem, but the key one is right down here at the base of the ground, and it's called basal meristem. All right, so dicots have apical meristem, grasses have basal meristem. This is really important because if this meristem tissue gets damaged, the plant is much less likely to continue growing. So let's go back up to our grass slide here. That means I'm going to jump down here to the fourth bullet point. Grasses are really well adapted to disturbance, and it's because of that meristem location. So remember, if the meristem gets damaged, the plant's less likely to grow. So if something comes up and if there's a fire that kills this above ground tissue, or if some herbivore eats the top of this plant, it's killing the apical meristem, and this plant is less likely to grow. In a grass, however, you can kill all of this above ground tissue, and you're not removing the main source of meristem, or this basal meristem. And so that means this plant's really likely to regrow. So that's what makes grasses so good at dealing with disturbance. So we think of grasses dominating places with grazers, right? And that's because they can regrow after they've been eaten, or they're really well adapted to fire. The other characteristic that grasses generally possess is that they have relatively large root systems. And in this case, when I'm talking about relatively large, I mean relative to the above ground biomass. They don't have as big a root systems as a huge tree, but if you make it relative to what's above ground, they do have really big root systems. Approximately 80% of the biomass in grasslands is below ground. So lots of biomass is allocated to those root systems. All right, so there's the characteristics of grasses. Let's talk briefly about succulents. Succulents are characterized as having CAM photosynthesis. Just kind of generally know that, but don't worry about what it means. We will talk about it later in the semester, what CAM photosynthesis actually is, but it's a special type of photosynthesis that allows them to be really good at conserving water. So here I have a bullet point that they're great at conserving and or storing water. So part of that is this CAM photosynthesis. I do want to point out that they can be either woody or herbaceous. Like in my mind, I think of a cactus when I think of a succulent, right? And it's herbaceous. There's not wood there. It's more like this picture on the left where it's all herbaceous material, but it's just specialized tissue to store lots of water. But this picture in the middle is of a baobab tree from South Africa. That's where this picture was taken anyway. And it's like a tree. It's got a woody trunk, but that trunk is adapted to store water. So you can see this big fat trunk here relative to the leaf canopy. So again, really good at conserving and storing water, but they're not really good at dealing with cold temperatures. So we don't see succulents in really cold places. And then the last functional group I want to introduce you to are the legumes. We won't talk about them a ton in this class, but they are important to know about. And you probably know of many examples, even if you're not familiar with them. Legumes are what we call nitrogen fixers. And what that means is that they can fix nitrogen or take nitrogen right out of the air. So most plants have to take up nitrogen that's in the soil, either as nitrate or ammonium or amino acids. So they kind of have to soak it up through their root system. And there's not a lot of nitrogen out there. I'm sure you all kind of have talked about or heard about the nitrogen limitation that occurs in most places. However, the amount of nitrogen, the majority of gas in our atmosphere is nitrogen gas or N2 gas. So if you got two atoms of nitrogen bounded together, you've got nitrogen gas. That makes up almost 80% of our atmosphere. So if you are an organism that can take nitrogen out of the air, you've got a huge advantage. You've got an unlimited supply of nitrogen. Well, these plants can't do it themselves, but they have this symbiotic relationship with a bacteria that can take nitrogen out of the air. And so these plants are really, really good at growing in disturbed areas where maybe there's not many nutrients for a little bit, or in other areas where there's very limited nitrogen. That's where they're best at growing. So just to point out first here, these little bumps on this part of the root system here, these are called nodules, and that's where the bacteria live. They live inside these nodules. Then the bacteria take the nitrogen out of the air and give it to the plant. In exchange, the plant will give the bacteria carbohydrates that it photosynthesized to feed the bacteria, so the bacteria has energy and biomass to grow. So that's where the symbiotic part of that relationship comes from. Because legumes don't need to take nitrogen out of the soil, they get it from these bacteria, they have relatively small root systems. So we talked about grasses having relatively large root systems. Legumes are the opposite, relatively small root systems. And then just some examples, you can see how many important crops that we grow that are legumes. So alfalfa, clover, beans, lentils, and peanuts, they're all in the legume family, or they're all legumes and nitrogen fixers. So really important group, doesn't really dominate many ecosystems, but they're an important component of it. Okay, those are plant functional groups. Again, it's a way that we try to classify plants to simplify the complexity that is out there. So instead of trying to understand every single species, we'll understand just subgroups of them to help understand how ecosystems are working. And as we go through the semester, I'll kind of introduce a few other more specific plant functional groups to you as well. But for the most part, this will cover most of what we're talking about. Okay, I am all done with videos. Again, there's going to be 2 quizzes posted. Well, okay, let me back up. I feel bad. You're going to have 4 quizzes for next week. You've got 2 readings, and each reading has its own quiz. I went over this in the last video, but I'll say it again. One of those quizzes and readings is quite short, so it shouldn't take you very long at all. The other one's a little more heavy, but I think the quiz is reasonable, even despite the density of that reading. But now with these videos, you also have 2 more quizzes. So you have a quiz associated with the biome lecture, which was the second lecture I posted. And then you have a quiz associated with the plant functional groups, which is the one I'm just finishing up right now. Note that those quizzes don't necessarily cover all of the important information I covered in the videos. They're just kind of there to encourage you and make sure you actually watch the video. But there's other important information in those videos. So don't just go through the quiz and think you've covered all the material that you'll need to know for the test. There's more in these videos than just that. Okay? All right, if you have any questions, shoot me an email and I'll respond to you and maybe respond to the whole class if it's pertinent to everybody. All right, good luck, have a good week, and I will see you next Tuesday.